courtroom was tense, filled with reporters, legal experts, and curious onlookers who had gathered for what was expected to be a routine hearing. But no one in that room, least of all the smug, overconfident judge, had any idea of the legal storm about to unfold. Elon Musk sat at the defendant's table, calm and composed, his sharp eyes scanning the judge who had just chuckled dismissively at him. The judge, a man known for his sharp wit and intolerance for those he deemed amateurs in legal matters, leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Mr. Musk," he said condescendingly, "perhaps you should leave the legal arguments to the professionals." The courtroom erupted in soft laughter. The prosecution's lawyers exchanged glances, sensing an easy victory. But Musk didn't flinch. He simply leaned forward, his expression unreadable. The judge had underestimated him, and that was about to be his biggest mistake. The moment Elon Musk opened his mouth, the entire courtroom shifted. Before we get started, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's get started. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel lightly against the desk, a smirk still playing on his lips. The room was waiting for Musk to fumble, to show that he was nothing more than a tech mogul playing lawyer. "So, Mr. Musk," the judge said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "since you seem to be so well-versed in legal matters, why don't you enlighten us? What exactly makes you think you have the expertise to challenge this case? Surely someone who spends his time launching rockets and making electric cars doesn't have the legal knowledge to navigate something of this magnitude." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The prosecution's lead attorney, a seasoned man with graying hair and an air of quiet arrogance, took this as his cue. "Your Honor, I think we can all agree that Mr. Musk is a brilliant businessman. But legal expertise? That's an entirely different world," he said, turning toward the jury as if addressing them personally. "You see, the law isn't about bold ideas and risk-taking. It's about precedent, about understanding centuries of legal principles. It's not something you can just innovate your way out of." He paused, letting his words settle. "That's why we have trained professionals, Mr. Musk. People who have dedicated their lives to the law. And no offense," he gestured vaguely toward Musk, "but reading a few legal books doesn't put you on the same level as those of us who have spent decades in the courtroom." Musk remained motionless. He didn't blink. He didn't fidget. If anything, he looked amused. The judge tilted his head slightly, sensing an opportunity. "You're a smart man, Mr. Musk. I don't doubt that. But surely even you can see that legal matters should be left to those with the proper training." The prosecution lawyer stepped forward again, emboldened. "Exactly. And this entire case is proof of that. Mr. Musk, I'd love to hear your legal strategy. What brilliant loophole you think you found, because from where I'm standing, this case is airtight." A murmur passed through the spectators. They were expecting Musk to either stammer or launch into an overcomplicated defense, something that would confirm what the judge and prosecutor were implying, that he was out of his depth. Instead, Musk finally leaned forward. He clasped his hands together on the table and tilted his head slightly. "With all due respect," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, "if this case were airtight, we wouldn't be in court right now." Silence. The judge raised an eyebrow, but Musk continued before he could interrupt. "I understand why you'd assume I don't know the law. After all, I didn't spend years buried in textbooks or memorizing legal jargon, but I do understand logic, and I understand contracts, and I understand loopholes." He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. You know, the very same things that billion-dollar corporations use to win cases, just like this one. The prosecution lawyer frowned. Meaning? Meaning, Musk said, finally shifting in his seat, that the law isn't just about who went to the best law school or who can quote the most legal precedents. It's about who understands the system well enough to navigate it effectively. He turned slightly, addressing the jury directly now. The law at its core is a set of rules, and if you understand the rules, you can play the game better than anyone. A whisper ran through the courtroom. The prosecutor huffed out a forced chuckle. That's cute, Mr. Musk, really. But this isn't a chess match. This is the real world. Musk didn't break eye contact, and that's exactly why I'll win. The prosecutor opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time, there was hesitation in his eyes. But that was just the beginning. What happened next changed everything. The prosecutor's forced chuckle turned into something sharper, colder. He squared his shoulders, adjusting his suit as if preparing for a final, devastating blow. "Oh, I see what's happening here," he said, his voice dripping with feigned amusement. "You're playing the outsider genius card, the misunderstood innovator who's just too smart for the legal system. But let's be honest, Mr. Musk. You're not here because you're some legal mastermind. You're here because you think your money, your fame, and your influence can outmaneuver the actual law." Musk's expression didn't change, but a subtle shift passed through the courtroom. A few raised eyebrows, a murmur from the gallery. The prosecutor had taken off the gloves. "You've made a career out of bending the rules," the lawyer continued, "looping around regulations, finding ways to avoid accountability. That's what billionaires do, right?" He turned to the jury, nodding as if he had just stated an undeniable fact. "But this isn't a boardroom, Mr. Musk. This is a court of law. And in here, you don't get to make the rules." The judge remained silent, but his smirk had faded. He was watching now, observing. Musk took his time before responding. He looked at the prosecutor, then at the jury, then finally back at the judge. "Fascinating," he said, almost as if he were testing the word on his tongue. The prosecutor blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You just accused me of bending the rules," Musk continued, his voice even, measured, "of using money and influence to navigate loopholes, and yet, if I recall correctly—" He turned slightly, his eyes locking onto the jury. "The entire foundation of this case is built on a technicality that your firm is trying to exploit. You're not here for justice. You're here because you found a tiny crack in a system and decided to drive a truck through it." The prosecutor's face darkened. "That's not—" "Oh no, please," Musk said, gesturing for him to continue. "Go ahead. Tell us all again how I'm the one bending the rules." Silence. Musk leaned back. "See, the real problem isn't that I understand the legal system too little. It's that I understand it too well." A ripple of reaction ran through the spectators. Someone coughed awkwardly. Even one of the jury members shifted slightly in their seat. The prosecutor clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to let this slide. "You know what? Let's cut through the theatrics," he said, stepping forward. "Since you seem so confident in your understanding of the law, let's put that to the test." Musk arched an eyebrow. The prosecutor grabbed a thick, bound legal document from the table beside him and dramatically flipped through the pages. He stopped on one, held it up, and cleared his throat. "Section 3, Subsection B of the contract in question, he read. It explicitly states that any breach of agreement results in immediate forfeiture of assets related to the disputed claim. Now, considering that clause, are you still prepared to argue that your company is in the clear? He snapped the binder shut and smiled. Go ahead, impress us with your legal brilliance. The room held its breath. Musk didn't hesitate. Sure. The prosecutor blinked. Musk clasped his hands together. You just read Section 3, Subsection B, but you conveniently skipped over Subsection A, which states, he turned to the judge, his voice cool, that no penalties can be enforced if a breach was the result of an operational oversight that was corrected within a reasonable time frame. The prosecutor stiffened. In other words, Musk continued, if the company rectified the issue before a formal dispute was filed, the forfeiture clause doesn't apply, which, fun fact, is exactly what happened in this case. A low murmur spread through the crowd. The prosecutor's smile had disappeared. But, please, Musk added, his tone almost playful, feel free to tell me again how I don't understand the law. Silence. The judge glanced toward the prosecutor. Counselor? The lawyer's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. And that was when the whispers started. The prosecutor's lips pressed together in a thin line. He knew he was losing control, and Musk wasn't even trying to humiliate him, he was just stating facts. But facts were dangerous when they came from someone like Musk, because they had a way of slicing through the spectacle, making the opponent look unprepared. The courtroom had felt like his stage only moments ago, but now it was shifting. The audience wasn't nodding along to his words anymore. They were watching Musk with the same curiosity people had when they realized they were in the presence of someone playing an entirely different game. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, straightening his tie, if the defendant wants to play semantics, we can certainly indulge him, but the core argument remains the same. A breach is a breach. He gestured widely with his hands, as if appealing to common sense. The spirit of the contract was clearly violated, regardless of technicalities. Isn't that true, Mr. Musk? Musk tilted his head, as if considering. Interesting point, he said. Now let me ask you something. Do you own a smartphone? The prosecutor frowned. Excuse me? A simple question. Musk shrugged. Do you own a smartphone? The prosecutor hesitated. Yes. Great. Have you ever scrolled past the terms and conditions and just clicked accept without reading them? A slight ripple of laughter flickered through the audience. That's not relevant. It's completely relevant, Musk said, because if you have, then by your own logic, you are guilty of breaching an agreement, since I can guarantee you violated at least one of those clauses at some point. The only reason you're not in court right now is because the companies that write those agreements know that intent and practicality matter. They understand that not every minor infraction warrants a lawsuit. He let that sink in before continuing. So tell me again, does the spirit of the agreement matter more than the actual words written in the contract? The prosecutor's jaw tightened. Musk smirked. Because if we're playing by your rules, we should probably start preparing lawsuits for the billions of people who have ever clicked I agree without fully complying with every minor clause. More murmurs, a few exchanged glances. Even the judge seemed mildly entertained. The prosecutor exhaled sharply, clearly realizing that this argument was slipping through his fingers. This is absurd, We're talking about a corporate breach of contract, not some casual software agreement. Oh, so context does matter? Musk asked, feigning surprise. Funny how that works. A few suppressed chuckles echoed through the courtroom. The prosecutor's ears reddened. His frustration was mounting, and Musk knew it. The moment you got your opponent playing defense, they were already losing. And Musk wasn't done yet. But the next move from the prosecutor would be their biggest mistake yet. The prosecutor's confidence returned in an instant. He had been waiting for this moment. He smoothed his tie, his smirk creeping back as he turned toward Musk with a gleam in his eye. "All right, Mr. Musk," he said, feigning patience. "Since you seem so confident in your understanding of contracts, business law, and ethical responsibility, let's test that genius of yours." He stepped toward the judge's bench and retrieved a stack of papers, flipping through them with deliberate flair. The courtroom watched in silence, everyone sensing that this was the prosecutor's final play. "You see," the prosecutor continued, "you've been talking a lot about technicalities, about loopholes, about bending the law to fit your narrative. But let's put that aside for a moment. Let's talk about something that can't be manipulated. Hard, irrefutable logic." He pulled out a single sheet and held it up. "I have here a legally binding financial agreement drafted under federal corporate law, filled with terms, obligations, and clauses. And I have a challenge for you, Mr. Musk. Since you claim to understand these documents so well, I'd like you to—" He paused for dramatic effect, then slammed the page onto the table in front of Musk. "Find the flaw in this contract." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Musk glanced down at the paper. "That's it?" he asked, his voice neutral. The prosecutor smirked. "That's it. You have 2 minutes. If you're as sharp as you say, you'll find the mistake. If not—" He shrugged. "Well then, maybe you aren't quite as untouchable as you think." The audience leaned forward. This was it. The prosecutor had set a trap. The document was filled with dense legal jargon, an intricate web of clauses, references, and subsections. It would take a seasoned lawyer hours to comb through it. The whole point of this challenge was simple: to make Musk look like a fool, to watch him flounder, stammer, and ultimately admit defeat. But Musk, he didn't even pick up the paper. He simply stared at it for a moment, then turned his gaze back to the prosecutor. "No need for 2 minutes," he said. "I found the flaw." The prosecutor's smirk faltered. "Excuse me?" Musk tapped a single finger on the top of the page. "This contract is invalid." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. The prosecutor's expression flickered with confusion. "That's not possible," he snapped. "This contract has been reviewed by multiple legal experts. Every clause has been triple-checked." "I'm sure it has," Musk said smoothly. "And yet, it's invalid." The prosecutor's jaw clenched. "Then explain it." Musk leaned forward slightly. "You referenced federal corporate law," he said. "But this contract? It explicitly states, on page 1, he gestured toward the heading, that it is governed under state jurisdiction. That's a direct contradiction. The moment any conflict arises, this entire agreement becomes unenforceable because there's no clear legal framework governing it." Gasps erupted from the audience. The judge straightened in his chair. The prosecutor's face turned an alarming shade of red. That's ridiculous," he sputtered. "That's not a loophole, that's a foundational error." Musk cut in. "One that renders the entire document meaningless." He folded his hands together. "And you wanted me to spend 2 minutes reading this. I could have told you that just from the title. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Some spectators openly chuckled. Even the judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. The prosecutor's confidence had been shattered in an instant. His foolproof plan, his unbeatable challenge, had collapsed before it even began. He fumbled for words, grasping at something, anything, to salvage the situation. But that doesn't change the fact that your company— Musk tilted his head. No, what it changes is the fact that you just presented an invalid legal document as evidence in a federal case. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. Which, correct me if I'm wrong, is a rather serious mistake. More murmurs. The prosecutor looked to the judge, but the judge was watching Musk now, intrigued. The power had shifted. The momentum was slipping away. The prosecutor exhaled sharply. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Let's move on from that." But Musk wasn't done. He tapped the document again. "You know what's really fascinating?" he mused. "This wasn't an accident, was it?" The prosecutor stiffened. "What?" Musk sat back. "This mistake. It wasn't a simple typo. It wasn't an overlooked detail. It was deliberate." His voice was quiet, but the weight of his words pressed into the room like a tidal wave. This contract was designed to be vague, wasn't it? The prosecutor swallowed. "That's absurd." "Oh, is it?" Musk's gaze was unwavering. "Because an unenforceable contract is the perfect tool for leverage. It looks official. It looks intimidating. But when it's challenged," he spread his hands, "it falls apart. That way you can pressure someone into compliance without ever needing to prove its legitimacy in court." A stunned silence. The prosecutor's lips parted, but no words came out. He had been backed into a corner. Musk had not only unraveled the document's flaw, he had exposed its entire purpose. The judge's gavel rapped against the wood. "Mr. Musk," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "are you suggesting that the prosecution knowingly presented an invalid document in an attempt to mislead the court?" The prosecutor's eyes widened. "Your Honor, that is completely unfounded. I'm merely analyzing the situation," Musk interrupted, "but I find it interesting." His gaze flickered back to the prosecutor. "Don't you?" The energy in the courtroom had shifted. The whispers had grown louder. A ripple of uncertainty ran through the jury. The prosecutor, who moments ago had been leading the charge, now looked like he was drowning. And then, just when everyone thought it was over, Musk dropped the final bombshell. He turned to the judge. "If I may, Your Honor, I'd like to request a formal review of this document's origins." The prosecutor went pale. Musk continued, his voice steady. "Because if it turns out that this document was knowingly drafted with an invalid jurisdiction clause, it raises a very serious question. Was this case ever meant to hold up in court, or was it just a tool to force a settlement through intimidation?" Gasps. Audible gasps. The prosecutor opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He had walked straight into his own trap. The unbeatable challenge had crumbled in his hands, and now it wasn't Musk on trial, it was him. The judge leaned forward. "That," he said, "is a very compelling argument." The prosecutor looked like he might be sick. The audience was buzzing, the spectators whispering furiously. The balance of power had completely shifted. Musk adjusted his suit, his expression unreadable. He had never raised his voice, never lost his composure. He hadn't needed to. The truth had done all the work for him. And the prosecutor, he was already falling apart. But the final moment of truth was still to come. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie with nervous fingers. His once confident smirk had all but vanished, replaced by tight lips and darting eyes. He glanced at the judge, then at the jury, as if searching for a lifeline. The silence in the courtroom had transformed. It was no longer an expectant hush, but an ominous void waiting for him to fill it. And he had nothing. Musk, on the other hand, sat with an air of effortless composure. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply watched, allowing the weight of his words to linger. The trap had been sprung, and the prosecutor was scrambling. The lawyer cleared his throat, forcing a tight smile. "Well, Mr. Musk," he said, his voice strained, "that was a very creative interpretation of the contract." A few whispers spread through the room. Creative? That was his defense. It was weak, and he knew it. Musk raised an eyebrow. "Creative?" he echoed. "I merely pointed out a glaring inconsistency." The prosecutor waved a dismissive hand. "A technicality," he said quickly. "Legal documents have all sorts of minor discrepancies. That doesn't change the overall validity of the case." Musk tilted his head slightly. "So now it's just a minor discrepancy?" He glanced at the judge. "Your Honor, just moments ago, the prosecution presented this contract as undeniable proof. Now that I've pointed out its fatal flaw, it's suddenly just a technicality." A murmur rippled through the audience. Musk wasn't just poking holes in the prosecutor's case, he was exposing his inconsistency. The prosecutor's jaw clenched. "The core argument remains the same," he snapped. "Mr. Musk, are you denying that your company engaged in questionable business practices?" Musk exhaled lightly. "I'd be happy to address any legitimate accusations," he said. "But first, let's settle something. Are we acknowledging that the contract you presented is invalid?" The prosecutor hesitated. He couldn't admit it outright. It would mean conceding a critical failure in his case. But the longer he stalled, the worse it looked. The audience could see his hesitation. Finally, he forced a laugh, but it came out stiff. "Look, we can go in circles about paperwork all day," he said, attempting to regain control. "But what really matters here is whether or not Mr. Musk's actions were ethical." There it was, the subject change, a transparent attempt to escape the hole he had dug for himself. But Musk wasn't going to let him off the hook. "That's interesting," Musk mused. "When you were the one presenting the evidence, it was critical. But now that I've exposed a major flaw in your case, you suddenly want to move past it." He turned to the jury. "Does anyone else find that convenient?" A few nods. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. "That's not what I'm saying," he snapped. "The contract was one piece of evidence among many." "Ah," Musk nodded. "So would you like to present another one? One that isn't fundamentally flawed?" The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it. His fingers tightened into fists. Musk leaned back. "I'll wait." The tension in the room was thick. The judge watched with interest, but it was the jury that the prosecutor should have been worried about. Their expressions were changing. Where once they had regarded Musk with skepticism, now they looked at him with intrigue. And worse, for the prosecutor, some of them were looking at him with doubt. He had to do something. Fast. "I think we're losing focus," the prosecutor said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's not let Mr. Musk's theatrics distract us from the real issue here." Musk chuckled softly. "Theatrics?" He gestured to the document on the table. "I didn't draft this. I didn't bring it into court. I didn't try to use it as evidence. He let the weight of his words sink in. That was you. More whispers in the crowd. The prosecutor inhaled sharply through his nose. His face was starting to flush. All right, he said, his voice sharper now. If Mr. Musk wants to talk about honesty and integrity, let's talk about his business practices. He grabbed another document from his table. Tell me, Mr. Musk, would you say that all of your company's contracts are flawless? Musk didn't hesitate. No contract is flawless, he said smoothly. That's why legal teams exist, to review, refine, and ensure clarity. But here's the difference. When an error is found in my contracts, I acknowledge it. I don't try to pretend it's irrelevant when it no longer serves my argument. Boom. The prosecutor's mouth snapped shut. The jury? They were no longer just watching, they were engaged. Some leaned forward, others exchanged glances. Musk wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was holding the prosecution accountable. The prosecutor ran a hand through his hair, his frustration becoming more visible. This isn't about me, he muttered. Musk nodded. That's true. He glanced at the audience, then back at the prosecutor. But it is about integrity, and I think everyone here can see who's standing by their statements and who's backpedaling. Laughter. It started small. A chuckle from the back of the room. Then another. Then another. The prosecutor stiffened. He could feel the room slipping away from him. He needed to regain control. Now, that's enough, he snapped, his voice rising. Mr. Musk, you think you're so clever, don't you? Musk shrugged. I think I'm prepared. Another murmur from the crowd. The prosecutor's face twisted in frustration. He wasn't just losing the argument, he was losing the audience, and he knew it. He gritted his teeth. You're just distracting everyone with word games, he accused. But when it comes down to it, you still haven't answered for your company's actions. Musk met his gaze evenly. And when you finally present a legitimate accusation, I'll be happy to respond to it. Silence. The prosecutor's hands clenched at his sides. Musk turned to the jury. I don't mind tough questions, he said. I welcome them. But what I don't appreciate is bad faith arguments. He gestured toward the prosecutor. First, I was guilty because of a contract, until the contract was proven invalid. Then, I was guilty because of ethics, but no specific charges were given. Now I'm guilty simply because my opponent doesn't like my answers. He shook his head. That's not justice. That's desperation. The prosecutor's nostrils flared. Musk gave a small smile. And I think everyone here can see it? That was the breaking point. The prosecutor slammed his hands down on the table. This is ridiculous, he shouted. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge frowned. The prosecutor quickly pulled back, realizing his mistake. But it was too late. He had cracked. Musk didn't react. He didn't need to. The moment had spoken for itself. The jury exchanged glances. The audience murmured. The energy in the room had completely shifted. Musk adjusted his suit. I believe you were saying something about distractions. More chuckles. The prosecutor's hands shook slightly as he straightened his papers. He wouldn't look at Musk. He wouldn't look at the jury. He had lost them. And Musk knew it. But the final moment of truth was still to come. The prosecutor's knuckles turned white as he gripped the table's edge. His frustration was now impossible to hide. He had come into this courtroom certain that he would corner Elon Musk, certain that he would dismantle him in front of the judge and jury, certain that he would walk away victorious. But now, with the case slipping through his fingers, He was running out of options. Desperation flickered in his eyes. He glanced around the courtroom, scanning the faces that once seemed neutral, but now held traces of doubt, intrigue, and even amusement. The jury members were no longer watching Musk with suspicion. They were watching the prosecutor, waiting to see if he had anything left. He straightened his jacket, took a deep breath, and forced a smile. Thin, unconvincing. "All right, Mr. Musk," he said, his voice regaining a forced steadiness. "You've certainly put on quite the performance today." Musk remained still, his expression unreadable. He knew exactly where this was going. The prosecutor took a step forward, turning slightly toward the jury. "Let's be honest here," he continued, his tone shifting into mockery. "What we've really seen today isn't some display of truth and justice. What we've seen is Elon Musk doing what he does best, distracting, spinning narratives, and using his charm to wriggle out of accountability." A few hushed murmurs rippled through the audience. Musk tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanging. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. The prosecutor turned back to him, his smirk growing. "You like to act like the smartest guy in the room, don't you?" he said. "Always one step ahead, always finding a way to flip the script. But tell me, Mr. Musk," he took a step closer, lowering his voice slightly, "if you're so brilliant, if you're so untouchable, why are you even here? Why does your company keep ending up in legal battles? Why do you keep finding yourself needing to explain away your actions?" A tense pause filled the room. The prosecutor turned back to the jury, raising his hands. "Because at the end of the day, it's all smoke and mirrors," he declared. "All of this, the clever wordplay, the deflections, the so-called gotcha moments, none of it changes the fact that Elon Musk is standing in this courtroom because his actions have consequences." He pointed a dramatic finger at Musk. "And no amount of legal gymnastics can change that." The audience murmured. Some nodded, others watched in anticipation. The prosecutor stood tall, his chest rising with forced confidence. He thought he had done it. His final swing, his last-ditch effort to frame Musk as a manipulator rather than a truth-seeker. For a moment, there was silence. Then Musk let out a soft chuckle. It wasn't loud, it wasn't mocking. It was the kind of laugh that came from someone who had already won. The prosecutor's smirk twitched. "Something funny, Mr. Musk?" Musk finally leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table. He met the prosecutor's gaze with calm amusement. "You just asked why I keep ending up in legal battles," he said. "That's a fair question." He turned slightly toward the jury, his voice measured, thoughtful. "But let's think about that for a second. What do all these legal battles have in common?" The room was silent. Musk nodded slowly. "I'll tell you," he continued. "Every single time I've been dragged into court, it hasn't been because I broke the law." He let the words sink in. "It's been because I disrupted something." A shift in the air. The audience leaned in. Musk gestured lightly. "Tesla? Disrupted the auto industry. SpaceX ? Disrupted the aerospace industry. Neuralink, Starlink, OpenAI. Every single one of these companies has done something that made powerful people uncomfortable." His eyes locked onto the prosecutor. "And what happens when powerful people feel threatened? They push back. They don't try to innovate. They don't try to compete. They try to litigate." The jury members exchanged glances. Musk leaned back, his expression knowing. "So, you're right. I do keep ending up in court," he said, "because every time I build something new, Someone somewhere doesn't like it. He spread his hands. And yet, here we are, and every single time, the truth wins out. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. The prosecutor stiffened. "That's a very convenient way to spin it," he said, quickly. His voice slightly strained. "But it doesn't change the fact that you still have to answer for your actions." Musk nodded. "Of course, and I do." He gestured to the courtroom. "That's why I'm here, isn't it?" He looked around, eyes sweeping across the jury, the judge, the onlookers. "But let's be clear about something. This case, this entire argument." His gaze returned to the prosecutor. "It wasn't about accountability. It was about making an example out of me." A beat. And I think we all know that by now. A shift. A visible, undeniable shift in the room. The audience wasn't just watching anymore. They were convinced. The prosecutor's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "That's just—" Musk cut him off with a single sentence. "Tell me, Counselor," his voice was almost casual, "who funded this case?" Silence. The prosecutor froze. Musk raised an eyebrow. "Because if we're really talking about accountability, shouldn't we start with transparency?" He let the question hang in the air. "Who exactly is so interested in seeing me taken down?" A murmur spread through the audience, growing louder. The judge glanced toward the prosecutor, waiting for an answer. The prosecutor's face paled. That's not relevant." "It's not?" Musk leaned forward slightly. "You just spent the last hour talking about accountability. Surely that applies to everyone, doesn't it?" The tension was suffocating. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. He had no answer. He couldn't answer. Musk exhaled lightly, as if he had expected this. Then slowly, he turned toward the jury, looking each member in the eye. "I don't mind being questioned," he said. "I don't mind tough debates. I don't even mind being wrong, because if I'm wrong, I learn." He paused. "But what I do mind is hypocrisy." A ripple went through the room. Musk nodded, as if making peace with the moment. Then he looked back at the prosecutor, tilting his head slightly. "So, Counselor," he said, his voice calm, steady, "do you still think this case was really about justice?" Silence. The prosecutor's lips parted, then shut. He had nothing. The audience knew it. The jury knew it. The judge knew it. And then, applause. It started with a single clap, then another, then another. Within seconds, the courtroom erupted. A standing ovation, people nodding, murmuring, exchanging looks that said it all. The prosecutor's face burned. He glanced desperately at the judge, but the judge merely raised an eyebrow. "Do you have any further questions for the witness?" The prosecutor's mouth opened, then closed. He shook his head. "Nothing further, Your Honor." And just like that, it was over. But the real shock was still to come. The prosecutor stood motionless, his face drained of its earlier confidence. His once commanding presence had withered under the weight of his own failed strategy. He had walked into this courtroom expecting to control the narrative, to paint Elon Musk as an evasive billionaire who manipulated his way through legal loopholes. Instead, he now found himself standing on shaky ground, exposed before the very audience he had hoped to persuade. For a long, tense moment, he said nothing. Then, without another word, he turned sharply on his heel and walked back to his table, avoiding eye contact with the jury, the judge, and especially Musk. It wasn't an admission of defeat, at least not verbally, but actions spoke louder than words. The battle was over, and everyone knew who had won. Musk exhaled softly, not in relief, but in quiet acknowledgement of what had just unfolded. He had seen this before, the moment when arrogance crumbled under the weight of truth. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to rub it in. The prosecutor's silence was victory enough. The judge cleared his throat, bringing order back to the room. "Thank you, Mr. Musk. You may step down." Musk stood, buttoning his jacket with his usual unbothered ease. But before returning to his seat, he turned slightly toward the jury, as if addressing them one last time. "This case," he said, his voice measured and clear, "was never about wrongdoing. It was about narrative control." His gaze moved slowly across the faces before him. People fear change. They fear those who disrupt the status quo. And when they can't out-innovate, they try to outmaneuver in courtrooms, in media, in public perception. He let the words settle. But the truth has a funny way of rising to the surface, no matter how many people try to bury it. The room was silent, hanging on every word. Musk gave a small, knowing nod. At the end of the day, intelligence, merit, and truth always rise above arrogance and manipulation. He paused for just a second. Always. A single clap rang out from the back of the courtroom. Then another, and another. Within seconds, applause rippled through the gallery, spreading like wildfire. The energy had shifted completely. What started as a legal battle had transformed into something greater, a moment that would be replayed, analyzed, and discussed for years to come. As Musk returned to his seat, the prosecutor sat stiffly at his own table, staring at the floor. He didn't protest. He didn't attempt one last, desperate remark. He simply sat there, absorbing his own downfall. The judge gave a final nod. "Court is adjourned." The gavel fell. But outside the courtroom, the real battle was just beginning. Social media erupted. Clips of Musk's most devastating takedowns flooded the internet. Memes. Reaction videos. Heated debates. Every corner of the digital world was now ablaze with discussions about what had just happened. Musk versus system trended worldwide. Some hailed him as a genius who had once again exposed the hypocrisy of the system. Others scrambled to reframe the narrative, desperate to regain control of the conversation. But the damage had been done. The truth was out, and it wasn't going anywhere. Comment sections were flooded. Musk just dismantled an entire legal team with pure logic. This man is playing chess, while everyone else is playing checkers. Whether you like him or not, you can't deny he just exposed how these cases are really fought. This wasn't a courtroom battle. This was a masterclass in staying calm under pressure. News channels debated endlessly. Experts dissected every moment, every pause, every shift in body language. Pundits scrambled to spin the outcome in their favor, but the public had already made up its mind. And the prosecutor? He faded into irrelevance. The man who had once commanded the courtroom was now just another cautionary tale, another reminder that overconfidence, when met with real intellect, would always collapse under its own weight. As for Musk, he simply moved forward, as he always did. There were rockets to launch, cars to build, ideas to explore. The courtroom had been just another battlefield, another test, and once again he had passed with flying colors. But the bigger question remained. What do you think? Should powerful individuals be challenged more openly? Or was this trial just another example of the system trying to suppress innovation? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe in standing up for the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because in the end, the only thing more powerful than influence is truth.